People rarely lie to protect the truth. They lie to control its size. That is what I learned in the final year of my marriage. Most deception is not really about making something disappear. It is about reducing it to a form the liar can still survive morally. That is why so many betrayals arrive in carefully measured phrases. It wasn't serious. It was confusing. It was only emotional. Nothing really happened. Those lines are not confessions. They are containment strategies. They are the betrayer's way of deciding, unilaterally, how much reality the other person is allowed to experience at once. And if you are a calm man, a measured man, a man who still believes dignity should govern the way hard truths are handled, that kind of language can delay your understanding far longer than it should. That was my mistake. For most of my adult life, I believed patience gave me an advantage. I thought if a man stayed observant, emotionally restrained, and unwilling to turn every fear into accusation, then when truth finally arrived, it would arrive cleanly enough to justify whatever came next. That was one of my blind spots. Another was more flattering, which usually means it survives longer than it should. I believed that because I was hard to provoke, I was hard to manipulate. In reality, quiet men are often easiest to manipulate once someone learns how to feed us partial truths. We do not always need to be fully deceived. We only need to be slowed down by our own reluctance to become unfair too early. A dishonest person can do a great deal of damage in that delay. My name is Andrew Ellison. I'm 48 years old, and until about 14 months ago, I had been married for 17 years to a woman named Marissa. We lived outside Denver, in one of those neighborhoods where every driveway seemed to contain the evidence of careful adult life. Clean SUVs, healthy shrubs, basketball hoops with nets recently replaced, porch lights on timers, houses that implied solvency even when the people inside them were held together more by discipline than by ease. We had 2 children. Our daughter was already in college, and our son was 16 when things finally came apart. I worked in internal controls and vendor risk for a national medical supplier, which meant process checks, documentation, audit review, contract exposure, and all the quiet architecture that keeps organizations from being surprised by consequences they were too optimistic to plan for. I trusted that world because it had standards. You could tell a good story in a meeting, but eventually paperwork, timing, and sequence still had the final word. At home, I gave the story too much room before I trusted the sequence. Marissa worked in nonprofit development for an arts education foundation. She was bright, socially fluent, emotionally articulate, and very good at sounding sincere in ways that made other people feel slightly more honest just for being around her. When I met her, I admired that. I was more deliberate, more inward, less interested in the aesthetics of social connection for their own sake. She brought movement, warmth, unpredictability. I brought steadiness, order, and a kind of calm she once said made life feel less temporary. In the early years, that felt like balance. And for a while, maybe it really was. I do not want to flatten our marriage into a fraud simply because it ended badly. That would protect my ego in ways I no longer need. There had been real love. Real tenderness, too. We survived the birth of our children, a stretch of financial anxiety when my company merged and nobody knew whose job would still exist 6 months later. Her father's slow neurological decline, my mother's death, and the usual 1,000 private burdens that turned 2 people into a household instead of a romance. We had history, shared humor, rituals, a whole lived language that only grows when 2 adults spend enough years beside each other to mistake their habits for weather. That matters because betrayal hurts differently when it enters something that once legitimately deserved your trust. If I am going to tell this honestly, I need to admit where I made it easier for her to misread me. I was too proud of being dependable. Not the loud kind of pride. The quiet kind men often mistake for humility because it doesn't announce itself. I handled the taxes, the insurance, the contractor schedules, the retirement accounts, the college savings, the car maintenance, the emergency reserve, the password vault, the health paperwork, the 1,000 invisible systems that make family life feel ordinary. I did those things because I was good at them and because someone had to. But usefulness has a hidden cost. If you provide stability long enough, some people stop seeing it as effort and start treating it as the natural condition of their life. If they are arrogant enough, They eventually begin calling the man who built that stability predictable, as if predictability were a failure of imagination rather than one of the reasons their life still works. Marissa used to call me grounding. Later, she called me safe. By the end, her language began shifting toward a more polished form of dismissal. I had become structured, practical to a fault, hard to surprise. Those phrases sound harmless in isolation. They are not harmless when they begin moving in the same emotional direction for years. They become categories. Categories become hierarchy. Once a spouse starts regarding your steadiness as a smaller way of being alive, she has already begun downgrading the very qualities that made your shared life possible. The first serious fracture in the marriage was not another man. It was asymmetry. Marissa began behaving as though her inner life had a more important moral status than mine. If she felt restless, that meant something. If I felt uneasy, I was reading too much into normal change. If she needed distance, that was growth. If I asked for clarity, that was pressure. She started talking about feeling undernourished by routine, which is one of those phrases that sounds profound until you look at what it excuses. Underneath it, what I eventually heard was simpler. The structure that once made her feel safe had stopped flattering her sense of self. I should have recognized that sooner. I didn't, partly because I loved her and partly because people like Marissa are very good at making selfishness sound like insight. They don't say, "I want more attention than marriage allows." They say, "I'm trying to figure out what parts of me I lost." They don't say, "I've started enjoying another man's gaze." They say, "I need to feel seen again." Those are not always lies. That is what makes them so difficult. Often they contain a true emotional fragment. The betrayal lies in what gets built on top of it. The other man eventually had a name. His name was Daniel. He worked in strategic partnerships for a donor consortium that interacted with Marissa's foundation. I met him once at a fundraiser. He was maybe 10 years older than her, with the sort of quiet self-possession people often mistake for depth because it asks so little of the room. Good suit. Moderate smile. Selective listening. The kind of man who knows that if he speaks just slowly enough and makes eye contact just long enough, women exhausted by louder men will tell themselves they have found uncommon emotional presence. Marissa described him later as surprisingly perceptive, which was a phrase she only used for people who had already begun mattering more than she wanted to admit. I noticed changes around his name before I admitted what they suggested. More committee dinners. More debrief drinks after events. More references to one-on-one conversations that somehow felt intellectually exciting enough to mention twice. There were changes in her body too, though I hate writing that because it sounds more obvious in retrospect than it felt at the time. She began dressing for certain evenings with a care that was subtler than vanity but not quite professional either. She smiled into her phone with a softness that flattened when I entered the room. She seemed elsewhere in small, repeatable ways. None of it alone justified accusation. That is how adult betrayal hides. It does not need innocence. It only needs enough ambiguity that the decent spouse delays what his own perception is trying to tell him. The first direct confrontation came after a Wednesday evening donor dinner that ended at nearly midnight. I asked, not accusingly, whether the evening had gone well. She said yes. I asked why she seemed strangely bright for someone supposedly exhausted by networking. She smiled in that patient, slightly superior way people use when they want your question to sound smaller than their answer. "You always think energy means something," she said. That line bothered me because it was true in a way she did not intend. Energy does mean something. It tells you where a person's inner life is being fed. Still, I said nothing more that night. That was my pattern in those months. Notice. Wait. Re-examine myself. Ask one careful question. Accept an insufficient answer because I still believed the marriage itself deserved that level of care. I did not understand yet that she had already started using my restraint as shelter. The real shift came when she stopped merely distancing and started managing the meaning of the distance. One evening, after I had asked why she seemed emotionally more available to her phone than to me, she sat down across from me and said, in a tone she probably thought sounded brave, "I need to tell you something, but I need you not to overreact." That phrase is never a good sign. It announces in advance that your response is the future problem while the speaker is still trying to avoid naming the present one. I said, "Tell me." She looked at me carefully and said, "There's a connection with someone. But it's only emotional." Only emotional. That was the phrase. I remember the room very clearly. The lamp on in the corner. The dishwasher humming in the kitchen. Our son upstairs with his headphones on, living above a conversation that would rearrange his family long before he knew what it contained. And what I remember most is not the pain. It was the precision of the phrase. She had clearly chosen it before the conversation. It was not confession. It was architecture. She wasn't telling me what had happened. She was telling me what scale of reality I was allowed to experience. I asked who. She said, "Daniel." I asked how long. She said, "It doesn't matter in the way you think." There it was again. Not only concealment. Hierarchy. She had begun deciding which facts retained moral importance and which should be reduced, blurred, or reclassified in the interests of her own survivability. I asked whether they had been physical. She looked directly at me and said, "No, it's not like that." I wanted to believe her more than I had admitted to myself. Not because I was naive. Because only emotional still sounded, in some private, humiliated way, more survivable than the alternatives. That is what partial truth does. It does not need to persuade you entirely. It only needs to make the next move harder. What followed was one of the ugliest months of my life, precisely because so much of it happened in civilized language. She spoke about feeling understood, feeling alive, feeling emotionally expanded in ways that had nothing to do with sex. She framed my discomfort as proof that I was overvaluing categories over connection. I tried, God help me, to speak carefully, to ask what had been missing, to say that emotional infidelity was still infidelity, to explain that intimacy cannot be rerouted privately and then presented at home as a nuanced life event. I explained too much. That is one of the things I understand now. My explanations reassured her. They told her I was still negotiating within the scale of truth she had selected for me. She could keep deciding what this was while I kept supplying moral seriousness to the conversation. The first thing that broke that arrangement was not my insight. It was my son. A week after her only emotional confession, I was in the garage pretending to sort tools while really just trying to stand somewhere that did not feel emotionally occupied, when my son came in looking for a basketball pump. He asked where his mother was. I said she'd gone to a foundation dinner. He hesitated, then said, "Is that the same guy from the hotel?" I went very still. "What hotel?" He looked immediately uncomfortable, the way teenagers do when they realize they have walked into adult territory they cannot map. "I don't know," he said. "A while ago. I saw a picture on her phone when she was showing me something. They were by a pool or something. I thought it was work." Then he shrugged and went looking for the pump as if the sentence hadn't just detonated the last clean part of my self-protective denial. That was the moment I stopped helping her. Not because my son had found definitive proof. Because a child had already noticed enough to speak. The lie had moved beyond the marriage and into the emotional weather of the house. That is a threshold I do not think decent adults are allowed to ignore once they recognize it. I did not confront her immediately. Again, that mattered. If I had, she would have met my pain with calibration. Denial. Narrowing. More management of scale. Instead, I did what my work had trained me to do whenever a story stopped fitting the sequence. I looked for structure. We shared a cloud photo backup because, like many married couples, we had accumulated a whole domestic system on the assumption of trust. I searched by location and date ranges around the weekends she had mentioned being fully booked or emotionally drained from donor work. It did not take long. Some photos had been deleted from the phone but remained in backup folders because people who get comfortable with deception often forget that systems preserve what ego thinks it has cleaned. There they were. Not explicit in the pornographic sense. That would almost have been easier. Worse in some ways. Daniel's arm around her waist at what was clearly not a professional event. The two of them on lounge chairs by a hotel pool, close enough that no intelligent adult could have mistaken the emotional meaning. A mirror shot in a room where her shoes were on the floor and his jacket hung over a chair. A dinner table set for two with a hand of hers visible in the frame wearing the bracelet I had given her on our 15th anniversary. And then one photo that ended whatever room might have remained for her phrase only emotional. The two of them kissing in profile, reflected in a dark window, unaware that the glass had preserved what her language later tried to erase. I stared at those photos for a long time. Not because I needed more proof. Because I was looking at the difference between reality and what she had decided I was strong enough to know. That difference felt more violating than the kiss itself. I met with an attorney before I said another word. Her name was Rebecca Sloan. Late 60s, composed, almost unervingly immune to excuses once sequence was clear. I laid out the confession, the phrase only emotional, the photos, the timeline, the child seeing enough to mention a hotel, the shifted spending. Rebecca listened quietly and then said, "She wasn't confessing. She was curating." That was exactly right. Marissa had not brought me truth. She had brought me an edited version of it sized for her own moral comfort. She wanted the relief of partial honesty without surrendering control over what the betrayal meant. Once I understood that, I changed. Not dramatically. Quietly. Deliberately. I stopped asking for more explanation. Stopped seeking reconciliation conversations whose only real purpose was to let her keep narrating herself as complicated rather than dishonest. I remained fatherly, present, responsible. I paid bills. Helped our son with school forms. Made dinner when it was my turn. But I withdrew the one thing my earlier self had kept offering her too generously. Interpretive mercy. That unsettled her quickly. One evening she said, "You've become really cold." I said, "No. I've just stopped participating in the version of this that helps you." That line landed because it named the exact thing she had been depending on. My pain had still been useful to her as long as it remained verbal, careful, and contained within the frame she set. The minute I stopped giving her that, the emotional power shifted. The turning point came on a Sunday afternoon. She wanted to talk. Of course she did. People who manage truth often want another conversation once the first version starts failing. Another chance to resize reality, to adjust the emotional framing, to regain authorship. She found me in the den with a folder on the table. "What is that?" she asked. I said, "The part you didn't think I'd ever see." She looked at me differently then. Less certain. I opened the folder and showed her the photo printouts, the dates, the backup logs, the draft petition, the timeline I had built from her own inconsistencies. She went pale. Then angry. Then wounded in the performative way people often become wounded when their own management of truth collapses. She said, "You went through everything?" I said, "No. I finally stopped respecting your version of the scale." That, I think, was the cleanest sentence I spoke in the entire collapse of our marriage. Then came the usual responses. It wasn't what it looked like at first. The photos didn't tell the whole story. She had been lonely for years. Daniel had become someone she could breathe around. She never wanted to hurt me. That line always interests me. People rarely mean they never wanted to hurt you. They mean they never wanted to experience themselves as the kind of person who did. I asked her one question. When you said it was only emotional, were you trying to protect me or yourself? She didn't answer directly, because there was no version of the answer that preserved the dignity she still wanted to imagine herself retaining. That was when the truth was revealed in full. Not merely that the relationship with Daniel was physical. The deeper truth was that she had not trusted honesty enough to present it unedited. She had believed she had the right to decide how much reality I should live inside. In other words, she had already left the moral structure of the marriage long before I knew how far the affair had gone. The divorce that followed was not dramatic. It was expensive, administrative, and quietly humiliating in the ordinary ways adult endings usually are. Accounts, schedules, disclosures, tuition planning, the house, our son becoming too perceptive too early. Daniel disappeared from importance faster than she probably expected, which did not surprise me. Secondary relationships often shrink once the contrast that made them feel meaningful is gone. What stayed with me longer was not the kiss or the poolside chairs or the hotel room. It was the phrase, "only emotional." I thought about it often. About how many people do that to the truth. Not only in marriage, in business, in friendship, in family. They reduce, soften, resize, relabel. Not to tell fewer lies, but to keep the full truth from arriving all at once. Because if the full truth arrives, it becomes harder to keep admiring yourself. About a year later, while we were finishing forms for our son's college visit program, she said quietly, "I really didn't think the photos would matter more than what I told you." I looked at her and said, "They mattered because they showed the distance between the truth and the version you thought I should live with." That is the message I would leave behind from my story. People often think evidence matters because it catches lies. Sometimes it does. But often it matters for a deeper reason. It preserves scale. It prevents the betrayer from deciding what their betrayal is allowed to mean. A receipt, a timeline, a message, a photo. Those things do not heal you. They do something more basic and more important. They protect reality from being downsized into a form more comfortable for the person who broke it. And if there is anything worth understanding from what happened to me, it is this. When someone says, "It was only emotional," listen closely. They are not always describing what happened. They are often describing what they still want to remain true about themselves. The photos said more. Not because they were cruel. Because they were honest enough to stop the story from being edited any further.